73 years of marriage, and the version that travels fastest involves the word hell. You've seen the thumbnails, you've absorbed the framing, and if you've ever sat through a certain sort of prestige drama on a wet Sunday afternoon, you've probably swallowed the whole shape of it without once deciding to believe it. A queen and her consort sealed inside decades of frosty silence, sleeping in separate rooms, retreating to separate houses, exchanging nothing that a private secretary didn't draft first. It's a tidy story. Go looking for the evidence, though, and most of it dissolves in your hands before you reach 1952. Now, before anybody accuses me of ghostwriting for the palace, let me set out what I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming this marriage floated along on rose petals for 7 decades while everyone involved beamed at each other over the breakfast marmalade. Real friction existed, and it survives in the documents. A naval career amputated at its peak, a poisonous fight over whose name the children would carry, a press pack that treated the couple's private life as public property for the better part of a lifetime. Those pressures bit, and the biographers don't pretend otherwise. But the leap from structural tension to silent hell belongs to the tabloids first, then the dramatists, then the rest of us, because a happy marriage inside a palace produces a dull afternoon, and a miserable one produces a franchise. That's the economics of it, and the economics have shaped almost everything written about these two since the 1950s. Nobody profits from the dull version, so that's the job for the next while. We'll take the accusations seriously, piece by piece, and hold each piece against what the biographers actually turned up, because an accusation this sturdy deserves better than a flat denial. Some of it survives contact. A surprising amount turns out to be aristocratic housekeeping mistaken for heartbreak, and running underneath all of it, from a family wedding in 1934 to a farmhouse in Norfolk 8 decades later, walks a man who spent his entire adult life being told he mattered enormously and counted for nothing, occasionally in the same afternoon. 2 things can be true at once, and with this marriage, they almost always are. One more piece of housekeeping before we start. Everything here comes from 4 biographers who did the archival work: Giles Brandreth, Sally Bedell Smith, Philip Eade, and Ingrid Seward, plus the Royal Archives for the speeches. Where they diverge, I'll flag it. Where the record runs dry, I'll admit it rather than filling the gap with atmosphere, which remains the single most popular method of writing about these two. Let's start with the meeting, because even the meeting arrives pre-mythologized. Ask most people how Elizabeth and Philip found each other, and you'll get some version of the letters. A wartime correspondence opening in 1939, a teenage princess writing to a young naval cadet, a romance conducted in ink across the years, when Europe busied itself tearing apart. Cinematic stuff reproduced so often that it now functions as the official opening credits. It also skips the beginning. Their first meeting fell 5 years earlier, in 1934, at the wedding of Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark to Prince George, Duke of Kent, which Sally Bedell Smith establishes plainly in her biography of the Queen. A family wedding then, cousins in a crowd of cousins, because European royalty in the 1930s functioned less like a collection of nations and more like an enormous, faintly inbred address book. None of which turns the correspondence into a fabrication, since Philip and Elizabeth did write to each other from 1939, and nobody disputes it. What the popular telling does is promote a middle chapter into an opening one, trimming away the 5 duller years in which 2 distant cousins knew of each other's existence and thought very little about it. Tidier that way. Why does the correction matter? Partly because it demonstrates, in miniature, how this couple gets narrated. The 1939 version delivers better drama, so the 1939 version Wabu won, and nobody needed to convene a meeting and vote to falsify anything. The tidier story simply outran the duller one, as tidier stories reliably do, and within a generation it hardened into the thing everybody knew. Hold on to that mechanism, because we'll watch it operate again and again, and by the end, it explains rather more about the silent hell than any private conversation inside Buckingham Palace ever could. A fact that sits awkwardly beside the fairy tale. The bride's father didn't much fancy it. King George VI hesitated, and Giles Brandreth preserves the 2 objections that stuck. Age came first, since Elizabeth struck her father as too young, and fathers of daughters have run that particular argument since roughly the invention of daughters. The second objection tells you rather more, because Philip, in the king's assessment, qualified as boisterous. boisterous. Sit with the word for a second, because it performs an enormous amount of quiet work, accusing him of no cruelty and no stupidity, only of volume. It describes a young man who filled a room inside an institution built almost entirely on the principle of not filling rooms. And that single adjective, delivered by a nervous king in the 1940s, amounts to the most accurate character sketch anybody produced of Philip in his entire life. We'll circle back to it. Then came the other problem, which owed nothing to temperament. Philip's 4 sisters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie, all married German aristocrats, and Brandreth confirms that several of those husbands carried verified ties to the Nazi Party. Hold the calendar in your head for a moment. Britain in 1947 sat barely 2 years clear of the war. Rationing continued. Bomb sites still gapped the streets of London, and into that country walked a prospective royal husband whose family tree ran straight into the enemy that dropped the bombs. Fair or not, that arithmetic governed the whole negotiation. The solution took the form of one of the more thorough acts of self-erasure in modern royal history, and Philip Ede lays out the full inventory. Philip renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, left Greek Orthodoxy for Anglicanism, took British naturalization, and surrendered his own name in favor of an anglicized version borrowed from his mother's parents. Mountbatten. Titles, church, nationality, surname. 4 things a person might reasonably file under load-bearing, all traded away before the wedding photographs. I want to tread carefully here, because it would take very little to overplay this into martyrdom, and Philip would have detested the sentimentality. He wanted the marriage, and nobody dragged him up the aisle. But the episode establishes something worth carrying forward, which is that from the very start, the deal on the table ran on subtraction. Give up this, and you may join us. Give up that, and you may stay. Lessons, as we'll see, were not learned. Worth noticing who folded, though. The king hesitated, the establishment muttered about German brothers-in-law, and the wedding proceeded in 1947 regardless, which tells you that whatever conversations happened inside that family, the hesitation didn't survive them. Elizabeth married him anyway. By the summer of 1951, Philip owned something entirely his. The Royal Navy suited him, and he excelled at it, visibly and measurably, on a trajectory Philip Ede describes as highly promising, which in naval terms means the people above him started drawing up plans. He earned that position through competence rather than proximity to a throne, and in a life increasingly defined by what he surrendered, the Navy remained the one column still marked as his. In July 1951, he took indefinite leave to cover royal duties because King George VI's health collapsed. Read the phrasing again, because the phrasing conceals the sadness. Indefinite leave, not resignation, not retirement, nothing so final as either, but a temporary arrangement pending circumstances, subject to review once things settle down, which is the sort of formula a household reaches for when it cannot bring itself to write the word permanent. Everybody involved understood perfectly well that things would not be settling down. The king died in February 1952, Elizabeth acceded, and the indefinite leave hardened quietly into a permanent condition, with no ceremony, no farewell dinner, and nobody willing to state out loud that a bereavement just cost a naval officer, in his early 30s, his entire profession. So, titles, church, nationality, name, and then 4 years into the marriage, the career as well. Whatever else you want to argue about this marriage, the sacrifices arrived unevenly, and every serious biographer of the man records it. The ledger runs one direction. I'd push back gently on one framing you sometimes hear, mind you, which treats the lost career as a single wound that then poisoned every year of the marriage that followed it. Edie documents the loss, not the poison. A person can resent an arrangement bitterly and stay devoted to the individual at the center of it, and much of what follows in this script argues that both conditions held true of Philip for 70 years. Having taken the career, the establishment came for the name. The question sounds almost administrative written down. What should the royal house be called? Elizabeth married a Mountbatten, and by any ordinary reading of how surnames worked in 1952, her children answered to Mountbatten. Philip's uncle held that view firmly and expressed it loudly, which turned out to be a tactical error of some magnitude, since nothing hardens a British establishment faster than the sound of a Mountbatten telling it what to do. Winston Churchill disagreed, and so did Queen Mary. The house would remain Windsor, and Bedell Smith records the outcome without much suspense, because very little suspense ever attached to a question on which a wartime prime minister and a dowager queen already agreed. Elizabeth issued a declaration keeping the name Windsor, and the matter closed. Philip's reaction survives, and it survives because nobody could improve on it. "I am nothing but a bloody Moabite," he declared, adding that he alone among the men of that country stood forbidden from giving his own name to his own children. Right. You could spend a long afternoon unpacking that sentence without exhausting it. The self-mockery lands first, because Philip always led with self-mockery, but underneath the joke sits an entirely accurate description of his legal position. An amoeba contributes nothing hereditary, since it divides, produces copies of itself, and passes on nothing from any second party. He read the paperwork correctly, and whatever the marriage amounted to emotionally, the Constitution filed him under decorative, a category no naval officer of his generation would accept without complaint. A compromise did eventually arrive, and it arrived the way these things always arrive, quietly, years afterwards, once the people who caused the row stopped caring. In 1960, the hyphenated Mountbatten Windsor entered use for descendants outside the HRH line. 8 years late, applying only to the family members standing furthest from the throne, but it existed. Now, does the episode support the silent hell thesis? Honestly, it's the strongest card the prosecution holds. A humiliation delivered publicly, endorsed by his wife's signature, on the question of whether he existed in any meaningful sense inside his own family. I'm not going to argue it away, but notice what followed. The marriage didn't fracture, he didn't leave, she didn't stop needing him in the room, and the compromise materialized because somebody remembered the wound and came back to dress it. Not brilliantly, and not promptly. Best not to dwell on the 8-year delay, though somebody in that household clearly kept an account open on the man's dignity, which is not how a marriage conducted in silence behaves. One more thought before we move on. The amoeba line reaches us at all because Philip delivered it to somebody who wrote it down, and men living inside a silent hell tend not to generate quotable material about their own humiliation. They brood. Philip performed his grievance out loud, in a phrase engineered for repetition, which suggests a temperament that processed injury by turning it into a joke in company rather than swallowing it alone. Late 1956, and Philip boards the Royal Yacht Britannia for a solo tour of the Commonwealth stretching across 5 months. 5 months, not 5 weeks. And the British press, presented with a consort at sea and a queen at home, reached the conclusion. The British press reaches roughly once a decade about somebody. The marriage must be finished. Ingrid Seward covers the resulting speculation in detail, and the names that surfaced ran exactly where you'd expect a newsroom to run. The writer Daphne du Maurier and the cabaret star Helene Corday. Both women knew Philip. Both acquaintances converted, with very little assistance from anything resembling evidence, into affairs. The Corday story deserves a proper look because it demonstrates precisely how this material gets manufactured. Philip knew Helene Corday from childhood, and they grew up alongside each other. When she married, he gave her away at the ceremony, which is what old friends do when a bride needs somebody to walk her down an aisle, and which the newspapers repackaged as proof of intimacy rather than proof of friendship. Seward's assessment lands bluntly: an innocent connection dressed up as a scandal because the dressed-up version sold better. And on the central allegation, the record runs emptier than the coverage implies. No verified historical evidence exists that Philip ever conducted an affair at any point across 73 years of what remained the most closely surveilled private life in Britain. Not one instance. Weigh that properly. Photographers tracked this man relentlessly. Dozens of staff moved through his houses. Courtiers with memoirs to write circled him for decades. And journalists with mortgages to service treated any scrap about him as currency. If the affairs occurred, something would have surfaced. Because something always surfaces. What surfaced instead? Rumor, recycled decade after decade, until the recycling itself started passing for evidence. The palace, an institution that would rather do almost anything than comment, commented. In 1957, it issued a categorical denial, calling it quite untrue that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke. Categorical denials out of Buckingham Palace do not occur weekly, and this one arrived in the middle of a rumor cycle the palace could comfortably have ignored. Make of that what you will. 2 cautions before we move on, because I don't want to overcorrect into cheerleading. A 5-month separation genuinely does strain a marriage, and I won't pretend otherwise. What the record lacks is any evidence that this particular separation strained this particular marriage, as opposed to fraying the nerves of every newspaper editor in Fleet Street who noticed a gap in the diary. The second caution cuts deeper. An absence of evidence across a lifetime doesn't function as proof, and a household organized around discretion produces exactly the kind of silence in which a careful man could conceal a great deal. We'll return to that problem later, because it deserves more than a shrug. What I'd resist is the automatic move the rumor mill makes, which promotes an unproven allegation to a proven one, purely because people kept repeating it after 1957. Let's talk about the Philip you actually remember, because I doubt he matches the one in the archives. You remember the gaffes, the blunt temperament, the remarks that drove press officers towards the aspirin, the general air of a man who regarded small talk as a form of assault. He earned that reputation honestly. Brandreth doesn't dispute a line of the public record, and neither should we. But the biographers who worked close to the household describe something the public version misses completely. That teasing, backslapping, faintly outrageous manner never stopped at the Queen. He aimed it squarely at her, in private, constantly, and the people who watched it happen treat the habit as the defining feature of their marriage, rather than an embarrassing footnote to it. Consider what that meant for the woman on the receiving end. Elizabeth spent her entire adult life inside a system engineered to prevent anybody from speaking to her normally ever again. People bowed, people retreated backwards out of rooms, and people agreed with her about the weather. Brandreth's argument, which I find persuasive, runs roughly like this. Philip's refusal to join in any of that theater supplied her with the one thing the institution could not otherwise provide, which is a person who would take the mickey out of her, mean it affectionately, and decline to apologize afterwards. That doesn't belong in a footnote to the marriage, and it may well constitute the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. Everybody else in the building treated her as an office. He treated her as a wife who could take a joke, which across 70 years turns out to be a rarer and more useful commodity than deference. Fatherhood, it must be admitted, turned out considerably worse. Philip parented as a strict disciplinarian, and Seward states plainly that the style collided with Prince Charles, whose sensitive nature never stood a chance under that management. That's a real cost, and I'm not going to soften it with a punchline. Some of the damage there followed both men for decades. What Seward also records is that Philip defended the wider family unit with considerable ferocity, hard on the individuals inside it, immovable against anything arriving from outside. Not an unusual combination in men of his generation. Not a comfortable one to grow up underneath either, as the eldest son could presumably confirm. There's a temptation when a man behaves badly as a father to run the fault backwards through every other relationship he held, and the silent hell thesis leans on exactly that instinct. If Charles suffered under him, Elizabeth must have suffered too, which satisfies emotionally and fails as history. Brandreth and Seward, approaching from different angles, land on the same distinction: the manner that wounded a sensitive boy amused an adult woman who grew up in the same world and could return fire. Boisterous, the old king called him, and 30 years on, the words still fit. Now we reach the evidence everybody actually cites, which concerns the sleeping arrangements. Nobody disputes the facts. Elizabeth and Philip frequently occupied separate bedrooms, and later in life they spent long stretches in different houses altogether, with Philip settled at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, while the Queen worked out of Buckingham Palace or Windsor. Separate beds, separate homes. Building a case for 73 years of silence, you'd start right here, and the dramatists invariably do. The interpretation hangs on context that almost never travels with the fact. Bedell Smith explains that connecting but separate bedrooms operated as a standing convention of the British upper classes, and the reasoning behind the convention runs thunderously unromantic. One person likes the room at 15 degrees, the other at 22. One rises at 5:30, the other reads until 1 in the morning. Houses of that size keep rooms going spare, and the arrangement solved a thermostat dispute rather than a marital one. Brandreth pushes further and dismisses the separate bedroom gossip outright as a misreading of class custom, noting that the couple shared a bed whenever they chose to. The bedrooms connected. Everybody drops that detail, and it happens to be the one detail that settles the question. a door between the two, which opened. Wood Farm deserves the same treatment. Philip retired there, into a modest house on a working estate, after 7 decades of being observed by absolutely everybody, while Elizabeth kept working, because monarchs do. Biographers read the arrangement as mutual comfort and mutual independence rather than estrangement, and the reading holds up. Nobody hid, nobody suffered exile, and the two of them saw each other whenever they wanted to. Notice which pieces of evidence the silent hell thesis leans on hardest. They're the ones requiring the least knowledge of how these particular people actually lived, since the thesis lifts an aristocratic sleeping habit out of a world of enormous cold houses, and reads it through the expectations of a modern semi-detached in Reading, where separate bedrooms carry precisely one meaning, different century, different plumbing, and not a coded confession of misery. I'll grant the thesis one concession, though, because it deserves a fair hearing. Living apart for long stretches in old age does describe a marriage no longer requiring constant proximity, and I doubt Brandreth or Bedell Smith would quarrel with that sentence. Where I part company with the dramatists is the jump from no longer requiring to no longer wanting, which the evidence doesn't support, and which the events of November 1997 flatly contradict. November 1997, the golden wedding anniversary, 50 years married. And Elizabeth, who spent half a century declining to volunteer anything personal in public about any subject whatsoever, stood up in front of an audience and volunteered something extremely personal about her husband. She described a man who takes no pleasure in compliments, then paid him one regardless, calling him, quite simply, her strength and stay all these years. She continued from there, telling the room that she, his whole family, this country, and a good many others, besides, owed him a debt larger than he would ever claim or any of them would ever properly know. Not a bad sentence from a woman who spent 50 years saying nothing. Hold that speech against the thesis we started with, because both cannot stand. This isn't a woman discharging a diary obligation, since every professional instinct she possessed drilled into her across 5 decades of never handing the press a single loose thread, pointed away from saying it at all. She spoke anyway, on the record, about a husband the newspapers spent 40 years trying to divorce from her. Philip, invited to reflect on the same 50 years, approached the task in a rather more Philip fashion. He nominated tolerance as the one working ingredient of a happy marriage, then landed the line that gives the whole thing away. The Queen has the quality of tolerance in abundance. It's a joke. It's a joke with the punchline aimed squarely at himself, in public, at his own golden wedding, which ranks as roughly the last venue a miserable man goes hunting for laughs. And it isn't only a joke, which explains why it survives. Between them, out of an unworkable arrangement inside an unforgiving institution, the two of them built something that functioned, and he named the mechanism precisely. She put up with him. That constituted the deal. He knew it. And standing in front of an audience, he thanked her for it in the only register he ever spoke fluently. Skeptics will object that royal anniversary speeches exist to reassure, and they'd be right about the genre. What the genre doesn't demand is specificity. A dutiful speech thanks the Commonwealth, praises the institution, and sits down, whereas Elizabeth's version identified a private quality in her husband, conceded that he'd find the compliment awkward, and admitted to a debt she couldn't calculate. Philip's version turned the tribute back on himself as a confession that living with him took effort. Neither remark reads like a press release. 50 years married, 23 still to come. Across all of them, the record produces no verified evidence for the misery everybody assumes. And one speech in which the most guarded woman in Britain called him her strength and stay. Right, time for the caveat, and it's a serious one, so I'm not burying it in the last paragraph where nobody looks. Everything I've told you arrives through filters. The monarchy runs on discretion, which isn't a criticism but a job description, and the consequence for anybody writing its history is that the private conversations of Elizabeth and Philip reach us almost entirely through courtiers, private secretaries, and authorized biographers. Consider the incentives operating on that group. Courtiers depend on the institution for their careers, private secretaries serve it, and authorized biographers receive their access from it, access that can be withdrawn the moment somebody upstairs takes offense, none of which turns anyone into a liar. It does mean that people with a professional interest in the crown, emerging well, assembled most of the archive we've been working from all afternoon, and they assembled it knowing exactly who would read it. So the honest position looks like this. Serious biographers agree the marriage held, and the counter evidence supporting them sits in the public record, documented and sourced. The 1997 speeches happened, no verified affair ever surfaced across 73 years, and the context around the bedrooms belongs to social history rather than spin. None of that amounts to mind reading, but the deepest emotional weather of that partnership, whatever passed between them on the bad nights, whatever she thought in 1952 as she signed the declaration that reduced her husband to an amoeba, sits permanently out of reach. They kept it. They kept it deliberately for 73 years, and they took it with them. Which means the silent hell thesis pulls off something quite clever, and I want to name the trick. It builds its story inside the one space nobody can inspect, which renders it unfalsifiable, and an unfalsifiable claim never dies. You can demonstrate that the bedrooms followed class convention, that no affair ever surfaced in verified form, that the Queen called him her strength and stay in front of the world, and the thesis retreats one room further back and murmurs, but privately. Watch it move. At some point, an accusation no evidence could ever dent stops working as history and starts working as a genre. So where does that leave us? A man who surrendered his titles, his church, his nationality, his surname, and finally his career, then spent a lifetime being called difficult by people who surrendered nothing whatsoever. The same husband, legally barred from passing his name to his own children, stayed regardless for 7 decades. A father whose strictness wounded his eldest son and whose ferocity guarded the family that son belonged to, and a consort walking several paces behind the most photographed woman alive, using the position, according to the people who watched them closely, mainly to make her laugh. That doesn't describe a hell, and it doesn't describe the wedding china version either, which I'd resist anybody trying to sell you instead. What it resembles, from the outside, from this distance, through every filter we've just discussed. 2 people handed an arrangement nobody sane would volunteer for, who worked out how to survive inside it and then simply kept going, long past the point where the rest of us stopped watching for a collapse. Tolerance, he called it, and he would. The stubborn fact sitting at the center of all this is that we invented the silent hell ourselves. Not out of malice, mostly out of appetite, because the alternative amounts to a functional marriage between 2 extremely private people, and nobody commissions a series about that. They never told us, and the silence belonged to them rather than to us. 73 years, 1 door between 2 bedrooms, and not a word for the rest of us.